Welcome to so many of you. We'll be looking at is climate change reporting and why it's really important, and some of those key things we can do to start really thinking about how we are doing it, and really start on that carbon reduction journey. It might be that you're very much at the starting point, or you're kind of halfway through, or you have a kind of quite a mature system that maybe has been handed to you, and actually you just want that little bit of extra support. So my name's Claire Brown. I am a senior consultant at Turner & Townsend in the social housing team, but I'm also a PhD researcher in climate change in UK social housing. So I have that kind of joint element to kind of have a look at. So we'll be looking at climate change in terms of the science and the policy context. We'll also be thinking about how we can start even accounting for our greenhouse gas emissions, and then how we can actually start getting movement on this. So action planning around this. So we start at the very beginning. If we think about actually what are the greenhouse gases, there are key kind of 7 key gases that we're really focusing on here. So these are known as the greenhouse gases. The most commonly kind of referred to and the one that is mentioned a lot in dialogue is around carbon dioxide. So if we look at our emissions profile, we're looking at about 76% of that. Where this is coming from is fuel. It's a use of fuel in transport and our buildings, so that's homes, our offices. It's also around things like kind of how industry is using processes. When we're thinking about methane, so CH4, we are thinking that this is about 16%, and that's very much coming from livestock, so beef and cattle production in the large part. We also have nitrous oxide, and then we have HFCs, PFCs, SF6 and NF3 as kind of other gases that are really important. They have very bespoke uses. SF6, for example, is used predominantly in kind of electricity generation, largely as a safety measure. So there is research looking at this to replace it. But again, for us in terms of social housing, it's largely going to be coming from carbon dioxide and to a lesser extent some refrigerant uses. When we talk about this as well, we talk about it in kind of CO2 equivalents. So it's making sure that we're talking in that right language about our gases, so that we have that clear kind of comparability when we are reporting around greenhouse gases. Why this is important? Absolutely, greenhouse gases are really important to keep our climate as we have at the moment. But the problem is that we are adding too many greenhouse gases into the mix, which is trapping more energy in the atmosphere, which is causing this heating up of the planet. This figure is from the Met Office, so this is updated from last year, and you'll see on the left hand side the 2 highest columns are from last July, when we experienced significant higher temperatures in the UK than we have been previously used to. We have seen CO2 levels fluctuate historically, however we're now in a position where we are increasing it from a man-made perspective, a human impact, and what we are seeing now is that systems are changing, those natural systems are changing, and it is taking us above that sustainable limits for life on Earth. In terms of the IPCC, the International Committee on Climate Change, publish a lot of information taken from a wide-ranging resource of scientific research, publish a lot of documents. This is taken from Working Group 3. All of these are available on their website, so you can go and have a look at those, and I would strongly advise you have a look at those, in particular for kind of getting more information. If you are providing information in your reports, that's a really good resource to have in terms of that scientific information. We've seen that the average greenhouse gas emissions have increased over the last decade in particular. And in order for us to be on the right pathway, we need to really think about limiting that peak of the emissions that we are emitting due to our activities, due to the processes that we undertake. It's not all doom and gloom. There is good news. There is big progress, and actually every sector has the potential to halve their emissions by 2030. This includes the built environments. This is where we fit in terms of houses. And the solutions are there. We just need to start mobilising. We need to start moving and acting on this. When we think about the policy context, it's really important to understand where this is coming from. So the Framework Convention sets this in terms of a foundation treaty around international collaboration and cooperation around addressing this issue of climate change. All countries in the world will be impacted by climate change. Thankfully, the Paris Agreement back in 2015 really addressed some of these issues around mitigation, adaptation, and importantly, finance, because this might be the motivating characteristic that we need to talk around making those changes happen in your organisations. So that special report around keeping to 1.5 degrees of change is really around what are the pathways we need to do, what are the significant areas we need to address. It's also bringing in ideas around poverty issues as well. We will see climate change impact people, and as we all probably know, in terms of social housing, people are at the core of that. So what we need to do is address it and really bring in those other ideas. And what we're trying to do as well is think about developing those policies to move things forward. The Met Office, again, a really great resource to utilise, is really thinking about actually what are the impacts going to be around this. So it's thinking about your locality, where you are, low-lying areas, regional areas that are coastal will absolutely have a risk of flooding. We will also see things around threats to farming and domestic food security. If we've got a changing climate, the growing conditions will be changing. Linked to this is drought and water insecurity. Those of you in the southwest, I'm sure, will be fully aware about issues around water availability at the moment. We've got issues around floods, storms and extreme heat. Previous couple of slides ago, we saw those excessive heat issues that we had back in July last year. And this is a significant issue because it directly leads to excessive deaths. So last year, 2022, we saw 3,271 excess deaths as a result of overheating in those summer heat moments. If we think about it in that context of that, that's 82 excessive deaths per day, and it's 6.2% higher than the 5-year average. So again, it's something we really need to start addressing because it has that human element. So when we're thinking about social housing, we're thinking about people, we're thinking about our tenants, the people who we are kind of looking after. When we think about housing and kind of reduction, we're really trying to address this demand reduction. So we're looking to reduce the amount. For homes, we're really focusing on heating in particular. So if you look at this chart, we've got heating as that kind of first bar or the red bar, and you can see that actually over time what we're trying to do is massively reduce that amount that we are utilising in our homes for heating specifically. So it's about how we kind of address that, and it's around decarbonising heating in homes. And that can be from a number of different ways. It can be around replacing gas boilers with air source heat pumps, for example, and it can also be addressing fabric first ideas, so thinking about insulation levels, heat loss through windows and doors, for example. So when we think about this and think about the UK context, the Climate Change Act sets that kind of precedent of what we are looking for, and it's about avoiding the risk of dangerous climate change. So that risk of harm to people, to ways of life, it's about that risk element. Those of you who are heavily involved in health and safety will understand that it's about harm to people and it's about that risk element. It is a law and legally binding framework that we do have to adhere to, and what we have to do is reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 100% by 2050. So that is a tall order. It is achievable. We know the technological solutions that we need to apply. We just need to act on that. So it's about how can we do this. So the pathways include, for the UK, looking at low carbon electricity. We're looking at decarbonising homes and businesses. So, we have office locations where we utilise maybe a gas boiler. We might have a CHP unit. There's a variety of different ways. So it's about decarbonising those. It's about addressing transport. So think about how we kind of get places using our vehicles. Things like repairs. How do we get out and around to repair our homes and houses? Reducing emissions from waste. So again, thinking how we utilise products, materials, addressing those kind of elements. Thinking about land. So thinking about biodiversity, thinking about woodland cover, and also thinking about the public sector as well. This has been a long-term plan in terms of reducing emissions in the public sector. I previously worked for a police force where we were really driving down our carbon emissions and working on how we could, address those issues of greenhouse gases in the public sector. So when we're thinking about our greenhouse gases, we refer to them in different scopes in terms of whether that is something that is upstream, whether that is something our direct control in our reporting company, and our downstream activities. A lot of these are very easy to get. So this might be from bills, it might be from invoices. Things like water bills are a really great way of recording that information. You might have some smart metering on site that's automatically updated, half-hourly meters, for example, and addressing this. Where we find that actually sometimes it can be more challenging, it can be around kind of purchased goods and services. So that's something that we are buying and understanding the impact of that and the emissions around that. We also have things around kind of leased assets as well. So we might not own particular property. We might have a rented office, for example, and those assets that we are kind of looking at can sometimes be a challenge to think about. But when we're thinking about actual materials have a whole range of different impacts. So this chart is just kind of pulled together and taken from How Bad Are Bananas? I'm sure many of you will have come across this book by Mike Berners-Lee. The link down at the bottom is there if you would like to get a copy of that. It's a great book to explore, but it's thinking about actually what do we consume and what is its impact. So when we're thinking about housing, if we look at steel and cement, you can see actually that steel has a significantly higher grams of CO2 equivalent than cement. When we're thinking about the food that we are consuming, a banana is 80 grams of CO2 equivalent. So we're thinking there about how it's grown, how it's transported, how it might be refrigerated, how it might be displayed in the retail, how we might consume it, but then also we have a waste product associated that. Those coffee drinkers of you around will see that a cappuccino versus a black coffee, you've got 235 versus 21 grams of CO2 equivalent. And what that's really showing is it's really demonstrating the impact of milk production. So thinking about where milk is coming from, how we are getting it. We've also got things like mobile phones in there and flights. So again, thinking about in our business, how we address all of these issues, they're all important. And sometimes we might like to apply a hierarchy to that in terms of our priorities. So when we're thinking about accounting for our greenhouse gas emissions, what we've got to do is really think about a multitude of things. This is one of the kind of clearest ways, I think, of kind of attacking this. So it's about setting the purpose. It's evaluating the context of your organizational structure. So where is the kind of the boundary of that? Where are the controls in that? It's setting those operational boundaries. So number 3, it's thinking about our 3 scopes. So our direct emissions, our purchased and everything else. It's thinking about a base year as well. If we're going to try and reduce it, we need to think how we're going to reduce it by. So for tracking purposes, this is really, really important. It's about calculating your activity data and then managing that quality of that data. When we're thinking about what on earth are our biggest impacts, it's really thinking about lots of different elements. So it's thinking about employee travel, purchased goods, leased assets, sold products, end of life treatment of products as well. So when maybe you do a retrofit of a property, what happens to those materials that are pulled out? Thinking about how you're looking at this. So what are the kind of emissions? If you've got something that's more than 40% of your profile, is there clear opportunities? Are there potential future resources or risks? And thinking about your key suppliers and key customers. So in buildings, we want to kind of think about those operational emissions. We've got some regulation linked to that. So we've got Part L. You might have properties that are BREEAM. There's also LEED as well, which is more used in the USA, but is something that is starting to be utilised in the UK as well. And when we're thinking of that building, it's really thinking about those operational emissions and the embodied emissions. So those embodied emissions are those emissions that kind of come before. So it's about the producing of that particular structure. What we're trying to then think about is our carbon emissions are the kind of energy, and then the emissions factor of that. So it's a simple calculation that we have there. I touched on this before in terms of, where we're trying to get to. And if you look at the yellow with the kind of the house with a little kind of lightning bolt in it, the power kind of bolt, you'll see that actually what we're trying to do is take it from a 67% heating to a 23%. So we're massively trying to reduce that. And we're trying to think about, okay, how can we do this possibly? And the reason is because actually that space heating in our homes is where we find we have our biggest perspective. You'll all hopefully be aware of energy performance certificates. So this is how legally, when we sell, rent or buy a property, this certificate should be made available. And it's about understanding where we're trying to get to. It is valid for 10 years. There are requirements in terms of getting to IPCC, which in itself might be a little bit of a challenge, but it's a really useful data set to be able to use. When we're thinking about kind of a carbon reduction plan in terms of the action planning, it's about kind of avoiding those carbon intensive activities in the first place. Then we're thinking about reducing those, so about improving our efficiency. So that might be around lighting. We still need lighting, but how are we going to do that? Is it going to be via an LED? Are we going to encourage natural light, for example? We might do replacement, so high carbon activities with low carbon sources, and then finally, and as a last resort, it's around offsetting that. So it's thinking about how are we going to do this, avoiding it in the first place, reducing, replacing, and then hopefully we have a minimal amount that we are left with. So when we're thinking about this, we've got to think about, how can we do this leading by example? What's in our control? And how can we influence the emissions? So of course, we can influence emissions through training, through awareness, through pilot projects, through energy champions. When we're kind of looking around doing that, one example here is around reducing, so about employee travel emissions. Developing a policy, looking at miles travelled, and then trying to come up with a target of reduction that we want to achieve and a particular date as well. So making sure it's a smart target. It's about making sure that we have that data. I'm sure this is something that isn't news. As soon as you've got some data, you can kind of look at it, you can analyze it, and it's about understanding those key impacts. It's about understanding the housing stock and the operational levels as well. It's about understanding actually the energy supplies that you kind of get through. This might be something that is managed through accounts, and therefore it's around the billing of that. Again, there can be some good savings there if bills haven't been addressed correctly. It's about contract management as well. As I mentioned as well in number 2, smart targets. So specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and time bound. Really useful, particularly when we're thinking about carbon. It needs to be something that is achievable. It should be challenging, but it should also be something that we can do. A lot of organisations actually align targets and reporting to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and particularly when, for us in social housing, this can be around fuel poverty, community cohesion and public health. So these are a really nice way of being able to communicate that. We also have, you know, kind of these co-benefits, around different elements of ways that we can report. So the Sustainability Report Standard for Social Housing is a really nice way of doing that as well. It's around encouraging the whole way of doing this. So collaboration is one of the real key elements that comes into this. It is around that kind of environmental, social and governance reporting as well. So if that's something the organisation is already addressing, it can be a really nice way to kind of link that in. But it should be bespoke and it should be appropriate for your organisation. So I think we've rattled through that. This is the last slide. So just to kind of bring that kind of whistle stop tour to a kind of conclusion. We have it in UK law that we have a target to bring all greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. That seems a long way away, but actually we need to get that action building now. We need to have movement on these reductions. You know, we're already seeing those impacts. So we're seeing those kind of changes in our weather that we are used to. We are seeing energy issues arising. If we can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we can address those issues, but also bring in those social elements that we're all, I'm sure, so passionate about. Decarbonising Britain's homes is an essential part of tackling that climate emergency. When we are thinking about the kind of climate emergency, it is something that is happening to us now. It's not something that's happening across the world. It is something that is happening, you know, across the UK. And I like to finish with this quote from Dr. Jane Goodall. Your life matters. You can't live through a day without making an impact on the world. And what is most important is to think about the impact of your actions on the world around you. So in the context of greenhouse gas emissions, I think that's my call to action.